we begin with late-breaking news on the trade front. Beijing lowering expectations ahead of tomorrow's high-level trade talks in Washington. We just heard from President Trump on those trade talks. Let's get straight to Kayla Tausche in D.C. with the latest. Kayla.
Well, Melissa, the markets have been whipsawing all day in response to Chinese officials telegraphing exactly how they feel about these trade talks and what they expect to be brought to the table. Earlier today, we had Chinese officials telling Bloomberg they're open to a partial deal, even though they're frustrated by the blacklisting of 28 security and technology companies. Then we had a Financial Times report about purchases of soybeans. But then we had a Reuters report later in the day that said that Chinese officials, because of that blacklisting by the Commerce Department, they are lowering their expectations for the outcome of these trade talks. Perhaps a shot across the bow to the U.S. government as it tries to figure out exactly what to do behind closed doors over the next 2 days and what potential truce, deal, or no deal to accept or leave on the cutting room floor, as it were. That report significantly moved the market, perhaps the intention of those Chinese officials who were speaking to those reporters. And just after that news broke, our Eamon Javers asked the president about his views on trade talks and his response to China.
There's really only two people that matter on this one, and that's President Xi and myself. We get along very well. I can't imagine he likes me the way he did when I first became president.
So certainly there are two people that matter, as you heard the president say, himself and President Xi, but they are not going to be meeting this round. It is going to be Vice Premier Leo He, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, and the U.S. Trade Representative. Perhaps if it goes well enough, President Trump and President Xi could meet next month. And if things go well in the next couple of days, you could see the tariffs on $250 billion not raised to 30% from the 25%. But definitely, Melissa, people are saying those sanctions that the Commerce Department announced are a real issue. It's just unclear how the U.S. is going to respond to all of these smoke signals that China is putting out.
Kayla, did it sound like the president was more optimistic about the chances of the deal in that latest, the public comments that he made just within the past 15 minutes or so?
He recycled some familiar semantics, Melissa, so it's not quite clear whether he's thinking any differently about it now than he was, say, Monday. He said he's been tough on China. He said the U.S. was down. He did hit back at China's view that it's stated for a long time any deal needs to be a win-win. It needs to show that China and the U.S. are on equal footing. The president said, no, we've been down. We're not going to do a deal that looks like that.
All right. Kayla, thank you. Kayla Tausche in Washington. So we saw the whipsaw action yesterday. We finished at the session lows. Today we finished close to the session highs. Guy, what do you make of all this?
Well, I mean, what do I make of it is it's very hard to handicap on a day-to-day basis the rhetoric that's going back and forth. But then, you know, to Kayla's point, President Trump actually said any deal has to be better than 50-50 in the U.S.'s favor because, and I'm paraphrasing now, so I apologize, we've been taken advantage of for a long time, which may be true, by the way, and the Chinese are walking it back. Again, from where I sit, I don't see anything getting done. Now, do they come away tomorrow and say, you know what, we've laid the foundation for President Xi and President Trump speak in a month? Yes, that's a bullish outcome, I think. I just don't see it happening. I think both sides are too dug in at this point.
Not even a small deal.
I don't believe so, but it doesn't mean that I'm right.
What's a small deal in your view?
Just on tariffs. Just maybe pushing out tariffs. Not anything on tech. Nothing on IP. But it's bipartisan. They have been taking advantage of us. This is a bipartisan issue. I think you're going to see a small deal, and that's enough to keep the market going.
I mean, no more tariffs, not putting in the next couple of tranches of tariffs. Wouldn't that be a very positive thing for the market?
I think it would be. Yeah. I mean, listen, the market has shown you that just the smallest bit of progress is positive for equities in the relatively short term. So if we get some kind of movement, if we get something where, like Guy had said, where all of a sudden, okay, President Trump and Xi are going to meet next month, I think that would be a positive move for the relatively short term. What I'm concerned about is that you cannot handicap this. There's been a lot of damage done. And if you look at kind of the strategic part of this, we know that Trump likely needs a deal before the election comes along. So he's going to be pushing for that. However, the Chinese don't. And they've pushed it out this long. And Guy's talked about this the whole time. Their incentive is to push it out until the election, see if they can get potentially a better deal. So I'm not sure, even if we have that progress, we might get short-term
I don't see a better.
But what's the the long term?
But BK, this is bipartisan. Everyone, Elizabeth Warren is just as hard on China as Trump is. So this is not. I think they're beginning to realize China is. that there's not an easier deal coming, no matter who is
Maybe.
sitting.
I'm not sure.
There's a better group to negotiate, possibly. I mean, when you think about it, listen, if we've done all of what we've done so far just to push out an increase of tariffs that didn't exist over a year ago, which have actually caused us to go into a manufacturing recession. If you look at that ISM data that we got in September, it was the lowest print since June of 2009, okay, showing contraction. If we just push out further tariffs, do you expect, the markets may like it, do you expect the global economy to unleash?
But you understand.
That's why I think it's a short term.
But you understand.
What's the point?
But you understand we're not doing this over tariffs. This was always about.
But that's the point, Steve. If you're just going to.
But you have no leverage over China. You have zero leverage over China.
Okay, but the longer this goes on, how much leverage do you think either side has if we go into a global recession?
It doesn't. Eventually, companies are going to have workarounds in their production levels or the supply chains, the same way we saw Apple
falls off. I mean, this is the thing. Not if demand falls off. Look at what we're starting to see.
Recessions are cyclical, Dan. They're going to happen. We haven't had one in a long time.
Neither one of us economists. I'm not going to sit here and argue with you. I'm just telling you.
No, we know that recessions are cyclical. You don't have to be an economist to say it. An economist, by the way, can only tell you we're in a recession after we come out of it.
No doubt about it.
I think that there's a fair point to be made, though, that President Trump would like to have a win in the column when it comes to China ahead of the elections.
But the point
It has nothing. It may not have anything to do with.
Is it a win? If he doesn't increase the tariffs that he put on last year, it's not a win.
What can be perceived, what he will portray as a win. I'm not talking about a real win. I'm not talking about a real intellectual property.
But that's a sugar high, right? If there's if there's a win, something he can chalk up into the real world. Then let's talk about what the market's going to do, right? So you get this incremental progress. The market may rally on that. But then the reality of what Dan's talking about is that we're already in this global slowdown, possibly recession. Demand is not picking up. And so ultimately, I think the market starts to get rational and say, OK, there was a win in that column, but it hasn't changed the economics any. And therefore, we continue to kind of get mired in this and potentially go lower.
It's interesting. Steve made a good point. It is bipartisan. I agree 100%. Yeah. But my pushback would be, if you give me just a few seconds, is a lot of this is now come down to saving face, especially for the Chinese. I think it's probably more important, although it's clearly important for President Trump. With a potential, and I'm saying potential, President Warren, I think maybe the negotiating style might be such that a deal can be struck and the Chinese can save face. I know that's somewhat nuanced, but I think it is important. President Trump has a very distinct style, and he's not particularly soft when it comes to some of the rhetoric that he goes back and forth. I mean, calling them enemies and such is not, it doesn't really help.
Have you heard Elizabeth Warren talk about Wall Street? She's not exactly warm and fuzzy. She argues
about
the
Wall
same way
Street,
she argues the same way, and about China. She argues the same way President Trump does, but I'll grant you that President Trump does it in a very, very coarse, in-your-face, Twitter, social media that's much more aggressive to the layman than Elizabeth Warren.